You've never heard of the most powerful oil weapon on the planet. It has no above-ground footprint, no derricks, no refinery towers, just a few nondescript pipe terminals sitting in Gulf Coast marshland, and 4 hollow mountains of salt carved out of the earth by hot water and patience. The United States Strategic Petroleum Reserve holds roughly 350 million barrels of crude oil, buried up to 2,000 feet underground. It can inject 1 million barrels a day into the American economy within 13 days of a presidential order. No votes, no debate, one signature. It is simultaneously an engineering marvel, a geopolitical weapon, and the most quietly consequential infrastructure you have never thought about. To understand why this exists, you need to go back to October 1973. Egypt and Syria launch a surprise attack on Israel. Within days, the Arab members of OPEC, the oil cartel, announce an embargo against the United States for supporting Israel. They turn off the tap. What happens next shocks a nation that had never considered itself vulnerable. Gas stations run dry. Lines stretch for miles. Fistfights break out at pumps. The American economy, built on cheap, abundant oil, goes into convulsions. GDP contracts. Inflation spikes. The Dow loses 45% of its value. A single political decision made in Riyadh had brought the world's most powerful economy to its knees. The lesson was brutal and simple. Energy dependence is a national security threat, not a policy problem, not an economic inconvenience, a threat. Congress passed the Energy Policy and Conservation Act in 1975, authorizing the creation of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. The idea was almost embarrassingly straightforward. Buy oil when it's cheap, hide it underground, use it when someone tries to hold you hostage. The question was, where do you hide 700 million barrels of oil? The answer was underneath the Louisiana bayou. Here is where the story gets strange. The Gulf Coast sits on top of something geologists call salt domes, enormous underground columns of ancient rock salt, pushed upward over millions of years by the pressure of sediment above them. They are, by accident of geology, nearly perfect oil storage containers. Think of it like this. Imagine you have a giant candle, but instead of wax, it's solid salt, and instead of being a foot tall, it's the size of a skyscraper. The SPR engineers used high-pressure hot water to dissolve the interior of these domes, hollowing them out over years into caverns of almost incomprehensible scale. Some individual caverns are large enough to hold the entire Chicago Willis Tower, lying on its side. The salt walls are self-sealing. They don't corrode, they don't react with crude oil. The pressure of surrounding rock keeps everything locked in place. It is, in the words of one DOE engineer, as close to a perfect container as nature has ever accidentally built. There are 4 sites: Bayou Choctaw and West Hackberry in Louisiana, Big Hill and Bryan Mound in Texas. 62 individual caverns in total, connected by a 1,000-mile network of pipelines to Gulf Coast export terminals. Loading oil in is relatively simple. You pump it down. Getting it out is more elegant. You pump seawater in at the bottom. Oil floats. The crude gets pushed upward, travels through pipelines, and arrives at marine terminals ready for distribution within 13 days of a drawdown order. The system was designed to move 4.4 million barrels per day at peak capacity, roughly what Saudi Arabia exports on a good day. All from underground, all invisible. And here's the part that doesn't get talked about. The type of oil matters enormously. The SPR stores primarily sour crude, high sulfur content, the kind that most modern American refineries have actually been re-engineered away from processing, which means that in a true emergency, getting the oil out of the ground is only half the problem. Getting it refined is another. That tension between what's stored and what the economy actually needs is one of the reserve's least discussed vulnerabilities. Let's talk about what this thing actually does in the real world, because the SPR has been used as a weapon more often than most people realize. In 1991, President George H.W. Bush authorized a drawdown during the Gulf War, the first ever, to stabilize oil markets as coalition forces moved into Kuwait. In 2005, Hurricane Katrina knocked out Gulf Coast refining capacity overnight. The SPR released oil into the system within days. Gas prices still spiked, but the collapse was contained. In 2011, the International Energy Agency, a coordinating body for Western energy consumers, agreed to a coordinated release of 60 million barrels globally, with the U.S. contributing half, as Libya's civil war disrupted supply. And then came the most aggressive use in the reserve's history. In 2022, following Russia's invasion of Ukraine and subsequent oil price shocks, the Biden administration authorized the release of 180 million barrels over 6 months, the largest drawdown in SPR history by a factor of 3. By the end of 2023, the reserve had fallen to roughly 350 million barrels, its lowest level since 1983. The strategic implications of that number are worth sitting with. At 350 million barrels, and with the U.S. consuming roughly 20 million barrels per day, the SPR represents about 17 to 18 days of total U.S. consumption. That's not 2 months anymore. The buffer has been cut dramatically, and refilling it at scale requires navigating a crude oil market that the releases themselves helped distort. There's a geopolitical dimension that goes beyond America's borders, too. The SPR is not just an American tool. It is a psychological anchor for global oil markets. Traders in London, Riyadh, and Singapore factor its existence into every price calculation. The mere announcement of a potential SPR release can move the futures market by several dollars per barrel within minutes. It functions as a deterrent, the same way a nuclear arsenal functions as a deterrent. Its power is partly in the fact that it exists, and partly in the uncertainty of whether it will be used. Remove it, and oil-producing nations gain leverage they have not had since 1973. Here's where the story gets complicated in a new direction. The SPR was designed for a world of oil shocks, sudden supply disruptions from wars, embargoes, and hurricanes. But the threat landscape is shifting beneath it. First, the transition problem. As electric vehicles scale and renewable energy expands, U.S. oil consumption will, eventually, decline. At what point does the reserve become less strategically relevant? The DOE has begun, quietly, asking that question. Second, the infrastructure age problem. The SPR's physical plant was built primarily in the 1970s and 1980s. Salt cavern walls shift, pipelines corrode. The Government Accountability Office has flagged maintenance backlogs and aging equipment concerns for years. A reserve you cannot draw down quickly is not a reserve. It's a burial site. Third, and perhaps most urgently, cybersecurity. The SPR's pipeline network is connected to the same industrial control systems that have proven vulnerable to nation-state cyber attacks. The 2021 Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack, which shut down fuel supplies to the U.S. East Coast for days, demonstrated how fragile that infrastructure can be. The SPR itself has not been compromised, but the distribution network it depends on absolutely has potential exposure. There are proposals to modernize, to diversify storage, to incorporate more light sweet crude, to harden digital infrastructure. Whether those proposals survive budget cycles and political priorities is, as of now, an open question. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve is not a museum piece. It is not a relic of the Cold War or a footnote in energy policy. It is the reason that the next time a tanker is seized in the Strait of Hormuz, or a pipeline explodes in the North Sea, or a cartel decides to make an example, the lights in your city stay on. The trucks keep moving, and the price at the pump doesn't double overnight. It is, in the most literal sense possible, the silence between the notes, the thing you only notice when it stops working. 4 hollowed-out mountains of salt, 62 caverns, crude oil pressed against ancient walls in the dark, waiting.